it water with the sheep in the box?
For our entire lives, basically since birth, we're taught some basic morals, most of which end up not actually being applicable or helpful in the real world, at least the one we have under capitalism. These range from sharing is good, which is opposed by almost everyone on the right and disincentivized by the entire economic system under which we live, which is almost entirely predicated on competition over cooperation and the idea that there are some people who are just better than others. Sharing is communist propaganda and makes Ben Shapiro want to shoot Elmo in the back of the head.
Every kid in America is going to hate you. You take it on Elmo and Sesame Street and Big Bird in your book.
Yeah, I kind of want to take him out back and cap him.
We live in a system in which a parent teaching a child to be kind and empathetic is setting them up to be less successful under a capitalist system than a monster who forces their child to compete to push themselves to form unhealthy relationships and coping mechanisms, because what matters is success, not happiness or kindness or empathy. Sure, the second kid is likely to be more unhappy, and the first kid may very well be kind, generous and empathetic, but they're much more likely to end up living in poverty, so we'll likely never get to hear their story, and they'll never become powerful or influential enough to have their perspectives shared as widely as the broken sociopath. What's my point here? Well, mainly to bring focus to the fact that many of the moral lessons we get taught as children are overly simplistic for obvious reasons, and in many cases contradicted by the society under which we live, but we continue to perpetuate them anyway. A child believes in equality and equal distribution of resources when you ask them about helping the homeless or whatever, because they have yet to be thoroughly conditioned by our broken economic system like the rest of us. As they see it, if there are people who need a home, why not give them one? Soon they'll be indoctrinated though. Soon. Of course, one of these moral lessons we have drilled into us is that stealing is bad, and unlike those I just mentioned, this one is heavily supported by our modern society and culture. The problem is that when we're taught these lessons, they're taught to us on a personal level and usually between individuals and equals. For example, a child might be taught that when Billy steals apples from Dave, this is bad, when he could just have asked Dave nicely to share his apples. It doesn't take into consideration that maybe the power dynamic between Billy and Dave is not that of equals, but of oppressor and oppressed, or that maybe Dave benefits from an economic system that allows him to exploit Billy, who is poor and destitute, forcing him to pick apples all day for him to sell, and only gives him, say, 1% of the profits he makes from selling those apples, which Billy did 100% of, and Dave did nothing. Let's say 1% of those profits is not enough for Billy and Billy's family to live a decent life, and as a result, in order to feed his family, Billy has to choose to either steal to survive and to feed his starving family, or let them die. Or to put it more simply, what if Dave refuses to give Billy any apples even though Billy is starving to death? In that situation, I would wager that most of us would agree that Dave is in the wrong and stealing may be justified, but under the assumption that stealing is wrong under all circumstances, that's actually not the logical conclusion. Likewise, a lot of people will point to things like the Ten Commandments and declare that thou shalt not steal is such an ancient intrinsic moral value that it's lasted thousands of years and therefore must be a fundamental rule of society or something. This debate has been going on basically forever, but most recently flared back up again a few months ago when a comic artist posted a comic that seemed to condone artists who need them stealing art supplies, and because YouTube reactionaries have no clue what it's like to be poor, struggling to survive by legal means, or indeed bother to question moral lessons they were taught at age 6, they all lost their fucking minds at the idea that an artist might steal supplies from a corporation who wouldn't miss it, because stealing is bad, you see.
Wow. So that's a thing. Mallory, you're not a bad artist. I like your art style. I like the colors you choose. But you're a bad person. And the fact that you would go back to these old habits of just making comics of people stealing and being awful and basically telling your entire audience, hey, it's okay to steal so long as they're big chain corporations, you know, that's just shitty behavior, and if anything, that makes you look like a ratchet bitch. That's trailer trash talk, seriously.
You promote thievery, and at the same time, at the same day, self-promote both your fucking Patreon and Ko-Fi. That is looking funny, not gonna lie. You're promoting thievery of non-essential items, and that is the problem. So basically what I'm saying is that petty thievery isn't quirky or epic. It's a crime for that matter. I can't believe we're having this conversation to an adult. So yeah, thievery bad, comic bad, don't be like this tool.
So, let's discuss in detail why shoplifting is good, actually.
Take what you can, give nothing back.
all theft is not created equal. I think this is something we need to really talk about more, because it seems like not many people seem to really understand this. Most of us understand that there is a scale of justifiability, whilst a lot of crime is definitely on the more extreme justifiable end, like obviously sexual assault or child or animal abuse aren't really defensible in the same way, for example, crimes on the other end of the scale, crimes of passion like murder, often are, for reasons of, for example, self-defense. In fact, most countries do not consider a killing in self-defense a murder at all, which is how police officers are able to regularly kill unarmed black people because they felt threatened by a child with a toy gun, or the existence of a dog, or just like a black person having the audacity to be asleep in their own home, or be accused of using a false banknote without any actual factual basis, by the way. And obviously there's the whole controversy around racial profiling and stand your ground laws to be had, but the fact of the matter is that a majority of the time, if you kill someone and you can prove that you believe that they pose a legitimate threat to your safety, you can and will be able to get away with that murder more easily if you're white, or at the very least be charged with a less serious crime, and most people will agree that you were justified in doing so. After all, if someone comes at you with a knife screaming, "I am going to kill you, I am going to stab you repeatedly in the face until you die," honestly, who would try to argue that killing that person in self-defense is unethical or should be punishable by any kind of serious measure? So I suppose you could say that on the murder to rape spectrum, with one end being extremely justifiable under specific circumstances and the other being heinous and unjustifiable regardless of context, unless you concoct extremely specific and unrealistic scenarios to try to make an extremely dumb point, the real crux of this debate is quite simply, where does theft fall on this spectrum? And obviously, most people on the opposite end of this discussion are going to say that it falls more towards the more extreme end, in that all theft is immoral regardless of context because stealing is bad. Other people's property is incredibly important, and anyone who violates the delicate sanctity of property and ownership is a scumbag and or monster. Even remember a teenager who shoplifts art supplies from a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Allow me to argue that actually not only is theft justified, even moral under certain contexts, but also that as a society we only seem to care about more obvious direct theft in the same way as we don't really seem to care about systemic violence, and maybe we should reevaluate our approach. This should be fairly easy, in the same way that, as we discussed previously, violence can be, under certain specific circumstances, entirely justifiable. Let's just briefly go over them now, because I suspect that this will not exactly be particularly mind-blowing or groundbreaking to most people, but this does need to be discussed before moving on. I've utilised YouTube's new chapter selection feature, so if you want to skip this section, feel free to do so. I think this one should be pretty obvious, and it's certainly the most common justification for theft, especially petty theft. Should we begrudge a starving man stealing food to feed himself and or his family? Wouldn't you also resort to theft if it was the only way to make sure your child didn't go hungry? Remember, many of the same people who share memes about how they would happily blow someone's head off to protect their family from scary leftists and non-white people are the same people who decry theft of any kind, regardless of context. You may say that this is uncommon, especially in wealthier countries in the West, but as capitalism squeezes the working classes tighter and tighter with each passing day, it becomes more and more frequent. It's only a recent development that people on unemployment benefits in the UK are unable to afford food, by the way, and yes, food banks do exist, mostly out of necessity because of the rising starvation rates, but they're often inadequate, and if they're out of stock or under-supported, you're fucked. Likewise, wages are falling as costs of living rise. More and more jobs nowadays use abusive and controlling tactics like zero-hour contracts, which keep people in poverty longer and make it more difficult for them to escape, and as a result, a lot of working class people are never 100% certain about what their income may be due to these erratic and unreliable hours. I personally know a couple of people, for example, who sometimes will be flush because they've been given more hours due to overtime becoming available or someone else needing a shift covered, and then other months will need to rely on a food bank to get through to their next payday, and that situation is only becoming more and more common as Tory austerity policies continue. Food banks are struggling to keep up with demand, and people are becoming more and more desperate. Just taking the Scottish area of Angus as an example, here's an excerpt from an article detailing local crime statistics. Monofetha and Sidlaw Lib Dem Ben Laurie said that he was saddened to see that shoplifting had increased by 23.3%. He said, "Shoplifting is a crime that should never be endorsed, however, these figures don't reflect a sudden surge of kleptomania. With food and drink being the most commonly stolen items, this reflects people driven to desperate actions by factors such as welfare reforms, increasing inequality, and an ever-rising cost of living. Poverty is inextricably linked to crime, and tackling inequality is one of the weapons in our arsenal reducing crime in our neighbourhoods. Independent Carnoustie councillor Brian Boyd said, "Shoplifting offences are up, and I agree with this report that increases in shoplifting is correlated with increases in poverty. Sadly, we are seeing rising austerity levels in Angus. The Tories are back, and we can see an increase in poverty, food banks and homelessness here on our doorstep." Likewise, just Google something like "robber apologises" or something, and you can find hundreds upon hundreds of stories of otherwise law-abiding people driven to theft out of desperation, unable to survive within the system. Here's one of a guy robbing a store due to needing to pay for a loved one's medical bill, even giving the cashier a hug and crying, for example. Here's one guy who passed the person who was robbing a note that said, "I'm sorry, I have a sick child." Then there's the guy who apologised for not having money as he was robbing the store, and there's an endless list. These stories are not unique. This may seem ridiculous or like I'm stating the obvious here, but remember, these tragic cases are still crimes. The people stealing to feed their family or pay a medical bill are still criminals and treated the exact same as someone who steals for completely unrelated reasons. Unlike a much more serious crime like murder, the motivations of a thief are rarely, if ever, taken into consideration when it comes to sentencing. There is no lesser version of a theft conviction, in the same way as manslaughter exists, and of course the various degrees of murder. Every one of these articles includes some variation on police are requesting information on the suspect and there is a warrant out for their arrest. Likewise, the desperation young impoverished parents go to in order to protect and provide for their children has led to a thriving black market in baby formula, as shops start putting it behind higher and higher security measures to deter thieves. These crimes could easily be prevented, not by cracking down on already struggling people and communities, but by making healthcare, food and baby formula, just as a start, free or at least accessible to those in the greatest need. But that's not going to happen under a ruthless capitalist system, right? At least not anytime soon. And hey, guess what? If your job is that of an artist, you need art supplies to make money to survive. But if you can't afford those art supplies because their prices are artificially inflated by an economic system built on greed, should you steal those art supplies so you can keep paying your rent? Should you just allow yourself to be homeless, unable to support yourself and die on the street? I would argue that in that circumstance, stealing art supplies is the moral thing to do, especially if it's from a big store or corporation. It's basically a victimless crime at that point. But is that true? Is stealing from the rich a victimless crime? Well, in short, the answer is probably yes, in my opinion, though there is some nuance to this point and certainly a lot of disagreement to be had. The difference here is one of philosophy and ethics. Is it justified to steal from a rich and powerful organisation as opposed to a person or even a small local store? I would say yes, though this depends on your own ethical framework, so allow me to attempt to convince you. First off, the immediate pushback I will expect from viewers of this video who disagree with my premise is some variation on, but what about the material harm caused? So let's deal with that. Not only do places like this have all stock insured, but they also make so much money that they wouldn't even miss those items or the lost revenue most of the time, especially considering the often absurd markup those places often apply. It's a slightly different situation, but as a quick example of this kind of thing in action, I used to work in a sandwich shop that bought syrup and paper cups at such a price that a cup of soda would cost them maybe 2 pence, but charged £1.50 for it if you bought it on its own. So at best, what shoplifting from, for example, Tesco's does is cause Tesco's to lose a negligible amount of money, and even extrapolating out to include all shoplifting still isn't enough to cause that much of a major dent in their profit margins, though they certainly like to pretend it is by demonising poor people who menstruate. Yeah, that's right, I said it, fuck you JK Rowling, and asking fellow customers to narc on people stealing tampons due to period poverty, because they can just claim back their losses on their insurance. And then there's the big one, which is the point that employers will actually cut hours, take losses out of paychecks, or even fire employees for allowing or not noticing shoplifting during their shift or on their watch, so to speak. This is illegal, and if this happens to you, you absolutely can and should sue your employer. But the fact of the matter is that this practice is just as much a crime on the employer's part as the actual theft is on the shoplifter's part, and the blame should not lie with the shoplifter, but with the employer in that case. For example, I was fired due to my disability earlier this year, but it wasn't my fault or the fact that I was disabled, it was the fact that my employer was willing to break the law, specifically the 2010 Equality Act, and as a result I sued them using a no-win, no-fee lawyer and will probably probably get a frankly minuscule amount of compensation due to legal fees, but I do get the satisfaction of having caused the legal department a minor amount of inconvenience, so in the end, I'm the real winner here. Likewise, if, for example, a piece of machinery you're using at work malfunctions and causes a fire, it would be unreasonable to punish you for being in the vicinity or for using it. For this reason, I would contend that the problem you have with that situation is actually not shoplifters or shoplifting in general, but the imbalance of power between employer and employee, which is absolutely worth discussing, and I might even have a couple of suggestions for how to resolve that particular issue, but I suspect that you may not like them if you're the sort of person to believe that the situation I just described is the shoplifter's fault for stealing to survive rather than the boss's fault for abusing their power and breaking the law in order to seek a retribution over a negligible loss that can and will be covered by insurance if it's even a big enough loss to be worth it. Here's an interesting question. If someone steals something from you, should you be able to steal it back? How about if someone forced you to work for them, sold the products of your labour and gave you a pittance to live off, even though you were the one who actually produced their wealth? What if you lived under an oppressive system that consisted of millions of these exploitative interactions and you had no choice but to exist within it? The point I'm making here is twofold. First, labour is entitled to all it creates, and the profits your bit of shoplifting may eat into are made up of blood money stolen from the workers in order to charge for what should be basic necessities like food, so I personally would have no moral qualms with the idea of someone choosing to steal from Tesco's for this reason as well as those mentioned previously. Likewise, I have to ask, if you're against, for example, an employee stealing from their employer, especially if they're not paid enough to live on their existing wage, why are you in support of employers exploiting their workforce to maximise profits, using the fruits of their labour to make shareholders very rich, while squeezing those on the bottom rung as much as possible? Amazon is a great example of this. They abuse their workforce, overwork them, refuse to give them adequate toilet breaks, forcing them to piss in bottles, place stressful and impossible expectations on them that disincentivize taking any breaks whatsoever, and pay them so little that they're forced to live in tents or in some cases are just literally homeless. Honestly, given all that, considering how much money Amazon makes to the point where its CEO is the richest man on the planet with hundreds of billions of dollars to his name, I actually can't really begrudge anyone working in an Amazon warehouse taking the I don't know, whatever they have in Amazon warehouses, I guess pretty much anything going by all the shit Amazon sells. In short, if you're against shoplifting because theft is bad, in order to be consistent you would also have to be some form of anti-capitalist. But is that really a form of theft? Oh boy, is it that time again? Let's bust out the Communist Manifesto, comrades!
Take what you can, give nothing back.
Much like violence, we seem to have excluded less direct forms of theft from our consideration of what counts as theft. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll be using Marx's theory of labour exploitation to try to argue that capitalism only functions because of theft. To quote from the Socialist Worker, because I'm one of those wankers now, the term exploitation often conjures up images of workers labouring in sweatshops for 12 hours or more per day for pennies an hour, driven by a merciless overseer. This is contrasted to the ideal of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, the supposedly normal situation under capitalism in which workers receive a decent wage, enough for a middle-class standard of living, health insurance and security in their retirement. Sweatshops are horrific examples of exploitation that persist to this day, but Karl Marx had a broader and more scientific definition of exploitation, the forced appropriation of the unpaid labour of workers. Under this definition, all working-class people are exploited. Marx argued that the ultimate source of profit, the driving force behind capitalist production, is the unpaid labour of workers, so for Marx, exploitation forms the foundation of the capitalist system. All the billions and bonuses for the Wall Street bankers, every dividend paid to the shareholders of industrial corporations, every dollar collected by capitalist landlords, all of this is the result of uncompensated labour of working class people. And because exploitation is at the root of capitalism, it follows that the only way to do away with exploitation is to achieve an entirely different society. Socialism, a society in which there is no tiny minority at the top that rules. Working class people who don't own the means to produce and sell commodities have one commodity they can sell: their labour power, their ability to work. In this way, workers are forced to sell themselves to some capitalist piecemeal in order to acquire money to buy the necessities of life. Exploitation forms the basis of all the profits shared among the entire capitalist class. It is not simply the case that the wealthy have a lot whilst the workers have little. Capitalists accumulate wealth through a system of organised theft from the working class. In short, your employer steals money from you by only paying you a fraction of the value or wealth you produce for them, and the system is set up in such a way that it's functionally impossible to avoid this kind of theft. theft, unless you go self-employed, I guess, but that's not an option for everyone. Often there will be a refrain of, you made your choice, from the opposition, so to respond to the specific counter-argument, the system is set up in such a way that a majority of people have no choice but to work or sell their labour to a capitalist or corporation, because it's becoming more and more difficult to exist on benefits, as we mentioned earlier. Even if you physically can't work, and Tory politicians are trying to force disability benefit claimants to work despite their inability to do so a lot of the time.
You shared an article on your Facebook page saying that disabled people could work for less than the minimum wage. Would you care to defend that?
Did you read the article?
Yes.
You read the article and it was about people with learning difficulties, about them being given the opportunity to work because it's to do with the happiness they have about working and the obsession about looking. It's about learning difficulties. It's about having.
How patronising! How dare you!
Did you? Some people with learning difficulties, they don't understand about money. It's about having a therapeutic. It is about having a therapeutic exemption, and the article was in support of employing people with learning disabilities. That's what it was.
How dare you! How patronising! How dare you!
And likewise, when we criticise landlords, people may say, go live somewhere else then, but the problem is that the system is designed so that the only options are either go homeless, live on the streets begging to survive and risk abuse at the hands of the general public, or submit to it and allow some wankstain who happens to have been lucky enough to afford to own property to extract a third or more of your wages, essentially under threat of violence. The same of course goes for necessities like internet, electricity and water bills. You can't go live in the woods and build yourself a nice mud hut, because the commons are long gone, and even obscure bits of woodland are usually owned by someone or other, and there are rules about what you can and can't do there, and of course living as a hunter-gatherer is usually not permitted. So you essentially have to live in a society, and in order to do that you have to have a majority of your value or wealth stolen from you by an employer, and most of the remainder stolen by other aspects and agents of the capitalist system, unless you're one of the very few who managed to become one of the corporate thieves. Profits, as the slogan goes, are nothing more than unpaid wages, and likewise rent is simply ransom, paying the local land baron not to send his goons to kick you out onto the street so you and your family can starve to death. Therefore, as I just mentioned, if you're not in favour of theft, you should be anti-capitalist, at least if you're being consistent about it. Or even if we ignore this, if we pretend that capitalism is not inherently exploitative and requires massive amounts of theft in order to function, the vast majority of all theft is corporate and institutional. In comparison to regular burglary, robbing, muggings and so on, the amount of money stolen through minimum wage, overtime, rest break and off-the-clock violations is astronomical, and this doesn't require any kind of philosophical or economic debate here. If your boss says he'll pay you overtime to work an extra shift and then refuses to actually pay you for that, that is very much a form of theft, and unlike the implicit theft inherent to the capitalist system, is officially recognised as a crime in the same way as robbery, and yet not only is it underreported due to the inherent risk carried by taking legal action against your employer, but carries significantly less risk and crucially rarely receives as harsh a punishment as more direct forms of theft, if at all. Now I know what you're thinking, and yes, I can imagine exactly what the comments are going to be, so allow me to preempt the criticism I know I'm going to get from the right-wingers. Is taxation theft? To which of course the answer is technically yes, in the same implicit sense as capitalist exploitation is theft, but so much more is stolen from the people through the means that I've just described that if tax is the one you're getting stuck on, you should probably reevaluate your priorities. Don't get me wrong, I have a lot of criticisms of taxation, especially as it's currently implemented. Ideally it needs to be aimed almost entirely towards taxing the rich, and it should be infinitely harder to evade than it currently is. Likewise, if we are going to cut back on taxes, the first things that should go should be the massive wastes of taxpayer funds like the military and police. Oh, you prefer we keep those? That's weird. I thought you were against state power and overreach to the point where you consider using your money going towards paying for poor people to not die a form of egregious theft, but using it to fund illegal death squads and violently smash unionising efforts in the third world or just open war crimes is totally fine now. That's weird.
Take what you can. Give nothing back.
You ever notice how the police tend to be much more concerned with the well-being of property than people? How the rich seem to be able to get away with so-called white-collar crime relatively easily in comparison to often much less significant and much less harmful crimes that working class and poor people commit? How about smashing the windows of a Starbucks or stealing a big bag of basmati rice is a heinous crime punishable by years in prison, but abusing, harassing and moving on the homeless in favour of making the local area look better, especially if there's a royal wedding or public event of some kind, is simply accepted public and or official policy? Or how about the way that conservatives lose their fucking mind over destruction or tearing down of statues or certain iconography, but turn a blind eye to, or in some cases even support, actual violence enacted by the state against peaceful protesters? The fact of the matter is that under our current system, property and those who hold it are more important and more of a priority than human lives. We'll spend millions doing up the Queen's house, but not on housing the families who lost their homes in the Grenfell Tower disaster, and treat people damaging private property as a greater crime than damaging human beings. Don't believe me? Smash the window of a Starbucks and see how much higher your sentence will be than someone who smashed, I don't know, my window, for example. And unlike Starbucks, the amount of stress, anxiety and financial difficulty and inconvenience having a broken window would cause me is extremely significant, because I don't have the time, money or resources to be able to fix the problem quite so smoothly. But you never see this imbalance of power taken into perspective. The institutional and systemic damage caused by capital to communities is rarely, if ever, reported upon, but any violent or disruptive response to that damage usually is, and the reporting has a very clear bias. The response to Starbucks' use of violence against black people by having them arrested, and anyone who has any inkling of what the relationship between police and black people has historically involved will be aware just how much of a threat of violence this is, was pretty milquetoast, and of course nobody on the Starbucks end was prosecuted. But if one of these people who they had arrested retaliated by smashing their window, do you think that they would be allowed the same lenience? If Starbucks had a smashed window, they could have fixed it in maybe a couple of days at most, and the impact on their profits or whatever would be minuscule. If one of the police officers had permanently injured or even killed one of these black men, they couldn't be brought back to life, and the impact of their death on the family and community would be incalculable. And yet, the potential action that involved property damage would have been treated as much more severe than the one that involved human life. To the point where if there are a number of people at the scene, blast balls, tear gas and rubber bullets will be used by the police to stop further property damage. From the same organisation that regularly kills innocent black people and seems to do nothing to want to stop further harm to people. Interesting that. All this stems from an economic system and culture that sprung from it of obedience to the status quo. Those in power deserve to be in power, and those without do not. Therefore, those in power know best, and any infraction carried out against them is simultaneously comparable to an act of violence against an individual person, but also significantly worse because it goes against the established way of things. Your boss can abuse you, but you can't abuse your boss. Your landlord can break the law to save money, keeping you in squalor, but you can't stop paying rent. Capitalists and their agents of violence can wage a vicious war of oppression against the people and even specific groups, but any retaliation is anathema, unthinkable, and the work of thugs and mobs. And of course, those in power can steal from you, but you can't steal from them. How convenient. Almost as if the entire concept of theft is bad is in fact an egregious oversimplification of an incredibly nuanced and complex set of ideas, and is not in fact true at all, or even a majority of the time, and actions and crimes taken against a multi-billion-dollar corporation with significant institutional and monetary power is not in any real sense comparable to actions and crimes taken against individual people with little to no institutional power or influence over greater society.
Yes.
Black Lives Matter defund the police. I find it disgusting that the LAPD is slaughtering peaceful protesters on the street. I had 2 friends go to the protest in Beverly Hills a couple days ago, and the protest was peaceful until the police showed up with their excessive violent force, shooting rubber bullets and throwing tear gas. Is this what you think of protecting and serving? Because I think it's bullshit. Fuck you, Michael Moore. I refuse to call you an officer or a chief because you don't deserve those titles. You are a disgrace. Suck my dick and choke on it. I yield my time. Fuck you.
Thank you, Juan Ramirez.
I'm not endorsing theft here. I'm not telling anyone to go out and steal a bunch of TVs or whatever. In fact, apparently if you try and put a TV through its bananas, they get really pissed off. I'm merely pointing out that this whole debate is significantly more complex and nuanced than we as a society often tend to think, because our understanding of concepts like this seems to begin and end with childhood mantras about how stealing is bad, without really any consideration for any of the deeper implications or even how much variation and exceptions there can be when discussing something like theft, because we live in a culture and under an economic system that prioritizes property and capital above all else, and it just never occurs to most of us to even bother to question the status quo. If you're concerned about theft, you should be vehemently against capitalism. This should be obvious to anyone who has any clue about how capitalism works, unless they have a child's understanding of economics and or are an ANCAP, which, to be fair, same thing. I don't know how we've got to this point or why I have to do this, but I'm astonished that now maybe people's lives are more important than objects or property is a subversive or controversial statement, but here we are. So, that's it. If you still believe that stealing is always bad, always immoral at the end of this video, then fine. Honestly, I'm impressed you managed to watch it all the way through. I'm not going to try and convince you anymore, but I do hope that this video at the very least helps to explain why people who justify shoplifting hold the beliefs that they do, and has at least made you think a little more deeply about why you hold the beliefs that you do as well.
You know, I'd really like to do that, but I don't have any fucking money. Like, I don't have any fucking money.
Hello everyone! So that was just a fun little video for you there. I quite enjoyed making that one. Although when I told my mum about it, she did get rather worried and was concerned that the police were going to come and tell me off, which was quite funny. I did make it clear, but I'm not actually telling you to go out and do shoplifting. I'm simply pointing out that under specific circumstances, I can completely understand and I would even support someone deciding to shoplift. Because unlike those on the right, I do believe that human life is more important than property. Anyway, you know why we're here by now. The names that you see on screen right now are my patrons who give me money each month to buy food. So thank you very much to all of them. If you do want to join them, you can do so by donating $1 or more to me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you donate $5 or more, you do actually get videos a couple of days early. Again, if I remember to upload them early. That's just the normal video essays. The other shit posts and shorter videos I just upload when I finish them. And you do also get your name read out at the end of the credits. Allow me to demonstrate. So today I especially want to thank Elise Jade, Bryden Beck, Calliope, Chris Ragnacci, Emily, Good Poon Hates Cops, that's Solid Poon then, Nanza Kambe. Next we have Brian, it's Brian, Pixels Green, Susie M, Theodore Pekelarov, The General Line, Thomas McCallum, and Tom Newport. Thanks so much for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!